Muchas gracias por venir. Hoy tenemos el gusto de tener en el IFEBA y va a estar por unos meses Lauren Halleck. Lauren nos conocimos hace muchos años en un taller y en algunas otras reuniones nos hemos encontrado, y el año pasado nos envió un mail a Laura Shadkian y a mí para presentarse para una Fulbright. Y una Fulbright rara porque va a pasar 3 meses en Argentina, 4 meses en España y 2 meses en Australia. Y lo conecta la temática de ecología de poblaciones y de dinámica de poblaciones. Y trabajamos últimamente en la red NatNet y en algunos otros proyectos con Conserve, database, vino con su familia a Buenos Aires y las 2 primeras semanas fueron de pura adaptación. Fue estresante, pero ya está establecida con el colegio, los chicos, así que un gusto. Esa es la introducción informal. La introducción formal es que Lauren estudió biología en Yale y después se fue a hacer un postdoc a Western Australia con Richard Hobbs, que es un ecólogo reconocido de restauración. Y después fue a hacer su PhD en UC Davis, en Berkeley, que es otra sede de la Universidad de California. Y después hizo un postdoc, el principal fue en Colorado, hizo su postdoc ahí. Y ahora tiene una posición de profesora en la Universidad de Oregon, University of Oregon, que siempre tengo lío porque es Oregon State o Oregon University, pero creo que todos tenemos ese problema. Y nos va a contar algunas de las aproximaciones que tiene para la conservación de la diversidad en el contexto actual.
Muchas gracias a todos y especialmente a Pedro por invitarme. Quiero practicar mi español, pero ahora no es el momento. Sí. Y entonces, thank you very much, Pedro and everyone. And today I'd like to talk about my work with developing conservation approaches for a changing world. And I'm going to focus on 2 of my favorite ecosystems. Serpentine grasslands in California and oak-prairie savannas in Oregon, just north of California. And I've chosen these systems, 1, because I love them, 2, because I think that we've done some really interesting work, but 3, because the way we've approached that work reflects the different ways that I think we can do good science for conservation. The first in the serpentine is going to be very basic science that then indicated some problems that we needed to manage for and indicated ways that we could manage them. And in the oak-prairie savanna, it's much more of a translational approach where we worked in combination with growers and land managers to develop conservation tools. And so I've chosen to highlight these partly just to reflect that there's many different ways that we can do good science for conservation. And to me, it always comes down to the questions that we think to ask and how we ask them determines the science that we do. And so being really reflective on how did we get to the question at hand and that there's different ways to do it. But first, so this is going to be 2 chapters or two stories for today. And the first is in the serpentine. I'd like to talk about how long-term basic science can indicate drivers and solutions for change. So just to orient you, this is the western US, and the study site is in San Francisco. And then within that, it's quite an urban area, so it's within the city, but then we have kind of just outside a former ranch that is now a research station for Stanford. And you know you are in the serpentine when you see color. So this is an aerial view of our research site. Where there's yellow, you have serpentine. And The reason is that soil structures the divide. So serpentine soils are found along fault lines, so where there's earthquakes and kind of serpentine soil comes up from the ground. It's very high in heavy metals. It's very low in nutrients. It's really rocky. It doesn't hold water. Basically, it's a really shitty place to live. That lands better in English. It's a lugar terrible to live, and so the plants that are there are often adapted to serpentine. So 10% of the species that are endemic to California, that originated in California, are specialized on serpentine, even though it's only 1% of the land area. And so it's really important for conservation. And it also has been an area that has largely been okay for conservation. Most of California has been heavily invaded by tall annual grasses, but because the serpentine is so hard to live in, it's been a refuge for native species. So because there's no resources, the plants are very short. So this is one piece of paper. They all, at their peak, could fit along the width. And it's also pretty patchy, especially on small scales. And so when my master's advisor, Richard, he started in the system in the 1980s, and he was interested in this question of spatial patchiness. And one thing he hypothesized was maybe that patchiness was created by disturbance. So we have gophers. This is from the movie Caddyshack. Again, I don't know if that lands here or not, but gophers can upturn the soil. Basically, it's like a little mini bomb goes off. All the plants are gone. There's a nutrient upwelling, and it's open space. And so he hypothesized that disturbance could maintain more diversity in the system. And so he started this experiment in the 80s. He excluded gophers. He dug the fence down to the bedrock, to the rock, so that the gophers couldn't get in. He also excluded rabbits. And he started tracking their responses. And what he found was that, in general, the short forbs had higher cover when there was no gopher disturbance. So this beautiful California goldfields, when you excluded gophers, had much higher cover than when you allowed them. So basically, they did well without the disturbance. But our taller grasses, so this is a non-native grass. It's all around the serpentine. It's sometimes in the serpentine, but often not because of low nutrients. But when it was in the serpentine, it needed that gopher disturbance. If there was no disturbance, the grass didn't do well. And he speculated that was because the taller grasses, their seeds could get to the open sites, and then they could really take advantage of that opportunity. So this was pretty seminal work on how disturbance can shape diversity. But the other thing he saw was that there was this major trend over time where both of them really crashed out towards the end. And to give you a visual of what that looks like, this is the early years with lots of that California goldfield, and this was 5 years later. So we thought, well, what's going on? And one thing that characterizes the system is its crazy variable rainfall. So this was the initial study period, up to 1,200 millimeters of rain, and sometimes it's as low as around 200 millimeters. And so he thought, maybe this is driving this temporal trend. And so he thought, I'll just keep measuring until I'm no longer surprised by the system. In 2019, he decided to retire. And he passed the system on to me because we continue to be surprised by some of these trends. And so to kind of give you, I'd like to do a visual. I hope this works, Sebastian. The files are big, but this is a visual just of what one of these plots looked like every year over time. So here's the first year. And as you can see, it's, oh no, espera. Espera otra vez. The files are very big. Go. Sí. pero solo es, 1990. This is a good year to stop on, actually. This little plant is plantago. It's the dominant native plant. It's a host for the bay checker spot butterfly, which a lot of work on meta-communities was done. The next year, totally different, right? So lots of plantago, now some perennial grasses and gold fields. It gets more sparse. Oh, you have 30 years to go. More grass, more perennial. It's really different over time.
Maybe one of the disturbances is just moving the soil or grazing.
It's mostly moving the soil. There's some grazing on the bulbs, and so there's a couple bulbs that get grazed, but the biggest factor is they come up and they just kill everything when they come up. No, not so much. Yeah. So by now, there's a period of time where it's very grassy, and often these were in wet years. There's tar weeds. The tall, dead plants are late summer tar weeds. At this point, I had started measuring, so this was my first year. This year looked totally different, right? So there's a lot of microceros. It has a small flower, and it can be very low biomass.
Always at the same time of the year?
Always the same time. Yeah, the first week or two of April. Yeah. The plantago was starting to come back. It's never takes quite so long. This was after a drought. We had good flowers, and then the grasses started to come back. Some more of the tarweed. And we're getting closer to the present. As you can see, the grasses are really coming in. Oh, this is actually another good year to stop on. This was a terrible year just everywhere. But at the grasslands too, lots and lots of grass, no flowers, no tarweed. And lots of tarweed, and kind of similarly coming back to the present. I will compress my files in future, but we are starting to see that there's just many fewer flowers and many more grasses until the present. And this last year should have been a really good year. It had been dry for a while and then rained. We have more flowers than in previous recent years, but it's a lot of grass. And just to show those trends over time, here's that yellow gold fields that Richard observed early on. And I've put all of the different exclosure treatments just so you can see that while those gopher patterns he saw spatially were important, they were completely subsumed by the temporal dynamics, right? So the change over time really was much greater than over space. Here we have this annual grass. Bromus, it had this period where it came in after those really wet years early on, and then was out of the system, and then it increased, receded, and increased. So I'd say this very cyclical invasion. And this is the dominant for plantago, important because it hosts the butterfly, and it had almost a decadal cycle. But each year the trough is getting a little bit lower. Oh no. Okay. And so when we think about why is the system so variable, what we knew fairly early on was crazy variable rainfall. But another driver that has been directional rather than variable is atmospheric nitrogen deposition. So because these areas are near San Francisco, where there's a lot of smog, there's a lot of car traffic, there's a lot of nitrogen that gets deposited from the air. This is my colleague Stu Weiss, who's done a lot of work on this. And for every hectare, there's about 4 pounds of nitrogen a year. That's a little under 2 kilos of nitrogen per hectare per year that's coming into the system that would be very nutrient limited. And so it's a big resource addition. And so my master's student, Elisa, took on this question, and she hypothesized that perhaps these grasslands are most sensitive to rainfall at intermediate levels of this nitrogen deposition. And that could lead to this increasing but cyclical pattern. So basically, she hypothesized that when you're at very low nitrogen, these non-native grasses could never enter the system. There's just not enough resources for them. So if you started with all grasses or you started with plantago, no matter what, you would converge to being a native state. And similarly, if you had a bunch of nitrogen, if you had really released the system from nutrient limitation, no matter what your starting conditions would be, you would go to grasses. But that in between, when fitness differences are equalized for nitrogen, you might have more sensitivity to rainfall. So under dry years, you would have any system go more towards the native plants. And under wet years, they would go towards these non-native acquisitive plants. So to test this, what Elisa did was she created different water by nitrogen conditions. And so she had no nitrogen at all in serpentine soils. She added the equivalent of 1 year of deposition and then the equivalent of 5 years of deposition, and did kind of at the lowest versus highest water holding capacity. And within that, she manipulated the plants, and I'm giving a subset of the species she used, but she either grew them alone at medium density or high density, and then she put each of the other species in at low density within that. So we could always see what the low density performance of the species was given its competitors as its competitive environment and its abiotic water and nitrogen environment. And just to kind of show you what that looks like, here's one grass growing in a whole bunch of plantago. So she did this, and she used the data to fit population models, and then she used those models to simulate coexistence outcomes between these different species under different conditions. The way you do that is you can imagine you have two species. If you remove one in your models and you allow the other one to reach its equilibrium when it's by itself, you then can reintroduce the other species at low abundance. And if it can increase, the thought is it's probably able to coexist. And if it can't, then the thought is it's competitively excluded. So you can do this for each of the species and calculate its growth rate when rare. And that should give you an estimate of whether that species is likely to coexist under that competitive environment and environmental environment. And so what she found was one of the times where we've been like, whoa, you nailed it. For an experiment like this, I was really impressed. For plantago, under low nitrogen, it could always invade bromus, the non-native grass. So our conservative native plant could always increase regardless of water conditions. Under high nitrogen, it could never increase when rare against the grass, so it was always excluded. And under intermediate conditions, it could increase under dry year conditions, but not under wet. So basically that toggling where it could perform well under intermediate conditions when it was dry and not wet. And conversely, bromus could not invade under low nitrogen and especially under dry conditions, and could kind of barely invade, but still had, still actually could get in with some water under low nitrogen conditions. And then once you had some nitrogen in the system, was always in. And so what this suggests, and actually Elisa showed through then subsequent simulation, is these kind of coexistence dynamics create that cyclical ratchet and invasion dynamic from the grasses, where it invaded and receded to ever greater degree. Okay, so now we know the drivers, and we can understand why we're seeing this directional change even though there's so much variability. This is just an aside, but it's not done. So now a new grass is starting to come in with this change that's bromus has changed. So now can we use what we know about the system to figure out how to manage it? And this work is done by my colleague Stu Weiss, and then we've done some follow-up like data verification. But we know that the grasses that are coming in with lots of resources, these tall annual grasses, if you're going to graze them, if you're a cow, that's what you're going to want to eat, right? You don't want to eat these native plants that are this tall. You want to eat the tall grasses. And so Stu's thought was, well, we know this is happening. What if we bring in the cows and have them graze the serpentine? This was pretty controversial because grazing is controversial. But he brought him in and has been doing this work. And I don't always trust fence line photos, but I think this one is actually pretty illustrative, which on this side, we don't have the grazing, but it's serpentine soils. And on this side, we have the grazing and serpentine soils. And to kind of show you what this looks like over time, this is a site my group then did some long-term analysis on. But in 2008, the cattle had been removed. This is what the serpentine grassland looked like. And then in 2014, so 6 years after bringing on the cattle, we had a lot more of this plantago, a lot more of the native flowers coming back. And so this suggests to me that we could use our long-term understanding of the drivers of the system, but also take an understanding of what species are being favored or not to come up with creative management solutions. Another thing that I think is pretty important from this is those results of that management also may take time to be observed given what we know about the system. So for example, this is a time series where there's a serpentine grassland that always had cattle. This is plantago again. Here's one where the cattle were not on, that we'd lost most of the native species. The cattle were reintroduced, and it took a little while to see a change. And there was some skepticism that this was an effective tool. But then once we had a period of time where plantago was otherwise doing well, likely because of rainfall conditions, it caught up to areas that had been kind of classically dominated by serpentine plants. And so taking that long-term perspective and thinking about these different drivers and how they interact both suggests what we should do for management, but also suggests what timescale we should be looking at for management efficacy. So to kind of conclude, for this system that I love because it's beautiful, because it's easy to work in, for many reasons, because it's high biodiversity, it's one where a few people with very committed science, doing basic science, uncovered a lot of really applied solutions for its conservation. Okay. Do you guys do questions at the end? Yeah. Okay. So on the other end of the spectrum, then, I want to give an example of our work that's much more translational, that's much more kind of user-up science for creating change and conservation. And so I want to talk a little about this approach. So translational ecology is when you bring ecologists and stakeholders and decision makers together to kind of co-develop research to address environmental problems. And so the way this kind of works is you can have a relationship where through dialogue you identify the relevant questions with all parties at the table. It can be very helpful because stakeholders could identify constraints that I as an academic just can't even imagine. But I can also do things like provide funding, provide insight into experimental design, like some of that expertise domain. Each of us can provide different resources. So stakeholders perhaps will give the land to study or experimental manipulation. And then I can bring in more funding, publications, and so forth. And so you get this kind of iterative process where the research from the beginning through the end is done in collaboration. And kind of to give you an example of some of this type of work in my lab, so here we are back on the western US, and now we're going to go to Oregon, where I live. And I live in a region called the Willamette Valley. And the valley has been has historically been all oak prairie savanna. So we had kind of oaks interspersed with a lot of kind of native flowers. Largely, it's been converted. We've lost all but 5% of our oaks. And the understory is very hard to manage because it's been heavily invaded. And much of our system now looks like this. These are hazelnut orchards. I looked this up. Avishana. See, and so it's a very big agricultural industry for us. We produce 99% of the U.S. market, and the way that these hazelnuts, Avishanas, are grown is in some ways reminiscent of oak prairie savanna, right? They're big trees, but unlike the oak prairie savanna, they don't let anything grow between them. And so kind of thinking about how do we conserve and restore oak prairie savanna in this matrix, I first started thinking about this when a grower named Taylor reached out to me, and he grew hazelnuts. So this is hazelnuts. He also actually had some pigs and some bison, and he was trying to go organic. So he didn't want to be using pesticides and herbicides, but he wasn't sure how to manage some of his pests with this. And specifically, there's a pest called the filbert worm that burrows into the nut and means that you can't eat it. And so classically, you just spray a bunch of pesticide. If you're organic, what you do is there's a period of time when the moth is in the nut. So if you get all of the nuts off the ground, you can break its life cycle. So in the fall, it's in the nut. In the winter, it's underground. In the spring and summer, it flies around. If you can remove the nuts that are infested, you can keep the populations low. So he was doing this pretty effectively. It took a lot of work. He had to be mowing a lot, clearing the ground a lot. But the problem is that this moth is actually native to our oaks, which are very endangered. And he had beautiful oaks on his property, and he was worried about pest spillover from his oaks into his hazelnut orchards. So he came to me saying, I have this idea, maybe we could use grazing, you do grazing, can we think about how to manage this? So his thought was that if you grazed your oaks, your kind of his oak areas with pigs, when the acorns were infested, you could break the life cycle of the moth in the oak stands. And at first I was skeptical because I study herbaceous plants, and I was like, you're gonna kill your understory. But his understory was so invaded that it didn't matter. He was just killing some blackberries. So we did this, and we did a team where I would say this is kind of classic translational ecology. He came to me with a problem and a question. I said, okay, let's try this approach, and I can get you some money, I can get you an experimental design, I can get you some really great students, and we'll test this out. And in return, he gave us the land and the pigs and did a lot of the implementation. So here are our pigs in our oak stands, and what we did was we used these emergent traps to measure how much of the pest, the moth, came up from the ground. And then we also used aerial traps to see how much was flying around. And what we found was that in areas that were grazed, the emergence of the pest was immediately reduced and consistently reduced. And so when we had that kind of grazing, we could keep the source population low. And early on, we didn't see such an effect on abundance because we were doing pretty small plots. But then we got excited, we did the whole lot, and we started to see a big change in abundance as well of what was flying around. And so to me, this was a pretty cool example of kind of doing this interface to create a solution that was good for the hazelnuts. It kept the pests down. It was good for the oaks. Some people had told him just to cut his oaks. We kept his oaks, and it was also really delicious pig. So it was kind of a win-win-win solution, which also helped their marketing at farmers markets that thought this was just super cool. But of course, in the way of translational ecology, if you're starting these relationships and starting this dialogue, it will go in directions you don't expect. And one of the directions it went for us was that at the same time, I was being asked to find ways to restore this understory. And I was really frustrated because most of the restoration was plant the one native grass that has very thin leaves that won't be killed by herbicide, and then just herbicide the rest. And that to me felt wrong. Like that's not the type of restoration that I personally am not excited about. Especially when over here they're dumping a bunch of herbicide as well. And we did think though that over here there's a lot of problem with soil erosion and contamination from trying to keep these orchard grounds bare so that they can pick up the nuts. We thought maybe there's a better way. Maybe we could basically restore some of what was the understory here into our orchards through the form of native plants as cover crops. And the thought was this. Classically, hazelnut growers in Oregon don't want to have any plant material on the ground because they think it will interfere with their nut harvest because they pick up nuts from the ground. And many of the kind of cover crops they use probably do. There's grasses that grow back in the fall rains. But our native plants, they germinate in the fall, they're there over the winter, they grow a lot in the spring, but then they senesce and they die back such that they're really not there in the fall. So we thought this could be a good opportunity for for restoring these species, but it also might be really good in these hazelnut orchards where there's big problems with erosion and there's big problems with a loss of organic material in the soil because there's no plant material there. And so we've been testing this we started small in 2019, and now we have like several $1 million to do this across the Willamette Valley. But what it looks like with the native cover crop cycle is in the fall, it looks really similar to these conventional areas. The ground is bare. But in the winter, we have a lot less rutting from equipment because there's plant material on the ground and there's a root structure in place. In the spring, when they are mowing the ground a lot and they're spraying, we have wildflowers. And then in the summer, when they're scraping with this box scraper to make the ground flat again because they've created so many ruts in the winter, we just mow one time to knock everything back and the ground is pretty flat. And what we found was that these native cover crops, they tolerate the farm operations. I wasn't sure they would, but they do. Just to put some data on it, here's where we don't do any management. Here's the kind of percent cover when you use, they call it flailing or a very close ground mowing. And here's when you're doing flailing and scraping. They're really resistant to it. And a lot of these plants co-evolved with fire. They're used to disturbance. And so this isn't that functionally different for them. And we're also starting to see that there's actually pretty big benefits for the growers themselves. And so this was clear this last fall. It was very wet in the fall, and a lot of nuts got stuck in the mud under standard practice. So this is the amount of nuts that got left behind when they harvested. But where we had our native plants, there was enough root structure in place that it was able to maintain the ground and they could pick these nuts up. And so growers are now getting pretty excited about this work too. And they're just rocking it. It's so fun to go out there and see these native plants that people are trying so hard to restore in oak woodlands and just can't because there's so much invasive plant pressure. And here they're doing really well. We're even getting camas, which is something that our area is really known for, to start growing in these orchards. We're trying. And so I just wanted to give that as an example of a totally different way of doing science where I didn't come with any of the questions. I kind of followed where people in dialogue led us, and that's really built up what's become a pretty big part of my research portfolio. And it's kind of this translational approach that can help us identify new questions and also opportunities. And with that, I'd like to thank Elisa, especially led a lot of the work in the serpentine, and Stu and Richard have been long-term collaborators. And then I just had a bevy of great undergrads and now graduate students that did a lot of the work in the hazelnut orchards, as well as partner farms. And thank you very much. And I'm open to questions. Muchas gracias.
clear and interesting. I have questions in relation with the serpentine grasslands, with the potential mechanisms that can explain also this dynamic of this species. One is related with the endophyte, and I think that grows as one endophyte that maybe is entering or I read some papers about caviar about it. And the other question is related with litter, that maybe we have seen in another experiments that the production of litter of this animal species, conserve species, auto-inhibits their abundance. So
Yeah.
I would like to know if you have measured that or if you have any.
That's great. So for folks online, the questions were in the serpentine for the annual grass. Do endophytes contribute to its cyclical pattern? And then also, what about litter feedbacks and plant material left on the ground? I haven't done much work on endophytes. There's been a lot in Oregon on the perennial pasture grasses. I don't know how much it matters for the annual brome. I haven't studied it. It's Bromus hortiaceus, so it's a different. I don't know. For the litter, it's a huge factor. So what we see is, the annual grass will build up litter, and if there's too much litter, the native plants won't germinate at all, which in some ways is actually probably good because it keeps their seed bank until there's a period of time where it's more open. But it does mean that you very quickly just have, that picture, just a bunch of litter suppressing things. And the other thing the litter does is, it will change the soil over time. And so in tandem with the annual grasses coming in, we're seeing other species that kind of go hand in hand with that I think is part of the litter feedback. And we see new annual grasses that probably never could have invaded that can now that there's the litter. I think the cattle grazing is really helpful because it removes the tall grasses, but it's also really helpful because the trampling breaks up that litter and creates the open space again. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is anyone studying the soil microbial communities and biotic communities in the serpentine? We're not. We've taken samples to do it, and then we haven't had the people or the money to process them. I don't know. When Richard started, serpentine was just this hot system where people were thinking it was a model ecosystem for everything else in the world. There's a whole books about, is this a good model system? And now there's a lot, there's a fair amount of work on serpentine conservation, but in this particular region, I'm often the only person out there in this spring. So there's not work that I've been doing. I'm not sure that I could really point you to a ton, but I think it's a really important question. Soy un poco cansada, pero...
Una es en relación con el serpentine grassland, ¿cuáles eran los herbívoros originales y el posible impacto del ganado sobre el ciclo del nitrógeno?
Sí, pues, I will answer in English. Historically, because the serpentine has so little biomass, it hasn't had a lot of large grazing. Thule elk would have been there, but my suspicion is that they were going to areas with big perennial bunch grasses, and there are some in the serpentine, but not a lot. There are a lot of rabbits, and that definitely will affect the dynamics especially the perennial grasses. And I think that they need those rabbits for kind of eating, when we excluded rabbits, we lost the perennial grasses, and I think they need they can kind of choke themselves out with litter if they don't have a little bit of grazing. So I think that actually might have been a pretty important dynamic for them. But I don't know about for nutrient cycling. There's a lot of nutrient cycling people here. I should know more.
Yeah. The second is about which were the problems in this translation ecology. In this,
Oh, yeah.
because it looks very good. But if you have some experience,
We-
example you have to share with me.
We have problems. So I would say the first example with Taylor is the ideal situation. The grower came to me. He was the kind of guy who, like, you know, he was a Peace Corps volunteer. He wanted to go organic. Like, it wasn't that hard to relate to him as a person. That's not quite right. It's just, he and I had a more similar background. And now that we're doing this cover crop work, there's people that are fourth generation that think, you know, keeping bare soil is the thing to do. And so I now have to really, I've had to be much more deliberate about finding common ground and building trust. And we're getting there. I think the thing that has been easiest for me is my student is a fourth generation hazelnut grower. She's taken on a lot of this work, and she's now like a research associate in the lab that's managing it. So her name's Marissa. And that has been incredibly important for helping to create those relationships with people that might have looked at me and said, you're at the University of Oregon, you're not at Oregon State, which for us is a big deal. It shouldn't be, but it is. So I'm not at the agricultural school, so they think, why, you know, I'm not a trusted source. But Marissa, they trust, right, and has built that trust. And so for me, it's been, I just show up to every event. If there's a grower meeting, I'm there. If I can find grants that give growers a bunch of money to do this stuff, those are the grants I go for. And so we're starting to build a much stronger relationship, because now I can say, hey, listen, I know you think I'm crazy, but I'll pay for all of it. And now you see some of these results. And hey, I know you think I'm crazy, but you don't think Marissa's crazy. Like, let's see, you know, how about you go to her farm and see what things look like? And a lot of them still think I'm crazy, but we're starting to have more buy-in. So, you know, this fall and next, we have more like 8 to 10 farms that are doing this, and it will keep growing. Make sense? Yeah. Taylor, yeah.
And I was wondering about putting the pigs in the oak, endangered oak ecosystem, and if there's not some concern that they're not only eating the infected acorns, but also the potentially viable acorns. And what is the worry about regeneration that's
That's a great question. So, okay, and I forgot earlier for folks on Zoom, or on the internet, but the question was, are those pigs going to eat our viable acorns, and what does that do for the long-term oak population? So, the infested acorns fall from the tree first. And this was actually something that we knew from indigenous knowledge. So, classically, the oak-prairie savanna system was maintained through fire. And so tribes would burn it, and they would burn early on before most of the acorns fell, but when the infested acorns fell. So they actually used burning to manage the pest population, because they ate the acorns. And then they would have an open area to harvest the acorns themselves. And so we've timed our pig grazing to mirror when they would have been burning. So we're getting those infested acorns, but then you still have a lot of, yeah.
You didn't incorporate any fire, any prescribed fire in your plan?
So the question was, we didn't incorporate any prescribed fire. We did not. I would say Marissa gets excited about these things. Part of the translational approach is you have to meet people where they are, and there's no way any grower that I'm working with wants to try to use fire. That's just not happening. And so, like, it would be detrimental to our process actually to even suggest it, because then I just look more crazy, even though it could be good. It's also very hard. We have a really big need to use fire for management in both Oregon and California, but we have had such an increase in big wildfires lately that the periods of time where we can burn are getting smaller and smaller because of air quality restrictions. So it's this very bad feedback where we need more prescribed fires because we're having wildfires, but we can't implement them because of policy.
Do you have enough pigs to manage the risk of fires?
So this is a great question. Do we have enough pigs to manage these systems? So part of why we've really switched to the cover crops as the big thing we're working on, the pigs kind of were our entry point, but very few growers will go organic. And even fewer of those have oak stands. And so this turned out to be a very helpful management tool for this particular farm, but there weren't enough farms where this was a big issue for them that we chose to scale up in that direction, versus the cover crops actually do better in conventional non-organic farms because we can clear the seed bank of natives. So we have enough pigs for that site. We've had some interest, and it's trickier. I don't know, for us, it's common for people to have like goat herds that you can hire out, and so you bring in the goats here and there. We thought about that model with the pigs, but the timing is so specific for the pigs that it's trickier, right? Like you have to bring them in at just the right time. So it's been more working with people on a as-need basis.
We have a question about grazing in the serpentine. Cows come in and you said it's grazing as well as the trampling. But how much is also that they remove the roots? Because normally they go to one place to defecate or they to rest.
Yeah.
And how much of that is also part of the process that you reverse some part of the nutrients?
Okay, so the question was for the cattle grazing, how much is it that there's also just removal of nutrients because the cows go off? There's certainly some, right? Like cows go on, they get a lot of, they grow, and then we remove them and we eat them. I think another big dynamic, though, is that it, as you say, changes the patchiness of the resources. And so Stu, for a long time, has wanted someone to write a paper about the biogeography of cow poop, because basically they're eating pretty consistently across the system. They defecate. The next year, they don't want to eat there. Like, they're sensible creatures. They don't want to eat where they pooped. But then the following year, it's just some really nice green grass, and then they target it. And so you do get this kind of spatial patterning where you can say, well, that was definitely a cow patty last year, and now they're really grazing one that's 2 years old. Like, it would be super cool to do a spatial analysis, but I don't think anyone has. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Si no, Loren va a estar en IFEBA hasta diciembre, quizás enero, depende si la escuela de los chicos nos aceptan durante las vacaciones. Y si no las pueden cuidar ustedes, they may offer to take care of the kids.
Oh.
Así que va a estar al lado de la oficina de Martín, que es la oficina de Claudio, y está muy contenta de estar en Argentina y está muy dispuesta a trabajar con nosotros. Así que, y ahora vamos a compartir el almuerzo en el jardín botánico, si se quieren unir. Y si no, estamos por acá.
Muchas gracias. And I hope